Today's maintenance job is to repaint the ABS ring, which is starting to get rusty. The bike's done just over 90,000 kilometres, so I'm not concerned that I'm getting rust now. And this should be a fairly straightforward job. So first step, take the wheel out. I'm only going to loosen the axle nut at this stage because the bike is not on the jack yet. And although theoretically it's not required, I find it easier to actually take the brake caliper off. It's easier to get the front wheel back in without having to juggle trying to get the disc inside the caliper as well. And it only takes a couple of minutes to take the caliper off. And saves a lot of swearing later on when I try to put the wheel back in. These rims are only painted and it's really easy to scratch the rim when you take the caliper off, so I'm just being careful not to do that. With that done, I just jack up the front a bit so that I can take the wheel out. You can do this process with the side stand down as well, but the centre stand does make it more stable. To remove the ABS ring, it's just a simple matter of taking these 5 bolts out. I expected them to be really tight, so I'm using a socket just to be sure, but I found that they're not really tight. And this is probably because they're only going into aluminium. Now with all of those bolts out, that ring just comes right out. Excellent. Not difficult at all. And you can see that it is quite rusty and yucky looking. So the first step is to just give it a bit of a clean with some acetone before I use the wire wheel on it. Because if there's grease or grot on it, the wire wheel tends to sort of smear it into the steel. Okay, so after a bit of wire wheel action on the grinder, it's coming up looking pretty good. But I can't get inside the ring, so I'm just using a little wire wheel on the drill press, speeding it up to as fast as it'll go, and then trying to carefully go around the inside. Because as we know, preparation is the most important step for painting. Now that all the rust and the old paint has been removed, I'll just give it a final clean. I'm ready for painting, and I'm going to use some of this silver gel. It's a Gelmet type paint. The only problem with it is you've got to be fairly careful. It goes on reasonably thick, so you've got to just put very light passes on it, otherwise you'll get big rundownies. But I've used it before on other jobs and it seems to work really well. Okay, job's done. I'll let that sit in the sun for a while before I start handling it. The paint I've used is pretty quick drying, so after about half an hour or so it's okay to handle. It would still scratch, so I'm just being a little bit careful about it. Now, the bolts that I took out didn't have any Loctite on them, but I'm just putting some fairly low strength Loctite back in just to be sure. It's quite possible that you're supposed to put new bolts in, but I'm not going to. Now, while these bolts are going back in, let's make one thing clear. You should never ever follow the practice of someone you see on YouTube, because we're all idiots. And I certainly am one of the biggest ones. I don't use a torque wrench on these bolts. I just use my elbow. But of course, if you were going to do the job, you'd look up the torque settings for every bolt that you tighten up. I'm happy to take the risk, but of course I would never recommend that you do. Anyway, the job's nearly done. It's just a simple matter of putting the front wheel back in, putting the caliper on, and Bob's your uncle. No doubt you're amazed that my experienced elbow knows exactly what torque to put on that bolt. Now, it's really easy to over tighten this pinch bolt. It really doesn't need to be super tight. It's probably a good idea to put a bit of low strength Loctite on the bolts that hold the caliper in, but I've never used Loctite on these and I've never had a problem with them loosening. But again, it's something you should probably do. When wiggling the caliper back onto the disc, it's always possible that the pads have been forced apart a bit, so it's always a good idea to spin the wheel and give the brake a bit of a squeeze to make sure that you don't surprise yourself the first time you go for a ride. So the job's finished. Here's the old, and now here's the new. A very simple maintenance job. Thanks for watching. See you next time.